in the latest rounds of sparring between India and Canada over the killing of Khalistani separatist leader Hardeep Singh Nijjar in British Columbia last June. Now, External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar has said that India had told the Canadian government that it is not its policy to engage in such acts. He's also gone on to say that Canada had, quote-unquote, a very permissive environment for secessionist activities. Now remember, this comes even as there were conjectures that were being drawn on India's silence after the first set of responses that branded the Canadian allegation as absurd, going on further to suspend visa services for Canada and calling out Canada for offering a quote-unquote safe haven for terrorists. This kind of language so far was only reserved for countries like Pakistan. Now, this also, in a sense, follows a lack of support by allies and friends like the United States of America, UK and Australia. While the latter two have shied away from any direct responses, keeping things within the diplomatically neutral posturing, the Biden administration did show clear leaning towards Canada. Case in point, 3 sharp statements. One by US NSA Jake Sullivan, who said that no country, including India, would be treated as an exception in the case. The other by US Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who called for the need for accountability and specifically spoke about close coordination between the United States of America and Ottawa. And the third by US Ambassador to Canada David Cohen, who said in as many words that the contextual information about India's possible involvement in Nijjar's killing came from the US. It was also brought to light that the dinner that was specially hosted by Prime Minister Narendra Modi for Joe Biden on the sidelines of the G20 summit in India also had the latter discuss this with the Indian Prime Minister. Although notably, this was still a private intervention by the US and not a public one, as Biden has been known to do in the past as well when talking to India about issues like targeting of minorities under the Modi regime. Why then this public warning? Is this because the Biden administration expected some cooperation from India and on the contrary found India's response as going on the offensive? And if the US or the Five Eyes Alliance members do have convincing intelligence which could be widely accepted on India's involvement on Nijjar's killing, is it really in the position to take a tough stance against India given their shared interests? Also, to what extent will the Biden administration and also the American media be cautious of the transnational repression allegation when it is very much an American governmental practice of carrying out these extraterritorial assassinations? After all, taking out General Soleimani, Osama bin Laden and al-Zawahiri are glaring examples of this very fact. Will that temper the American response? Or there aren't many takers for India's muscular politics internationally, an audience that Prime Minister Modi and External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar certainly find in abundance back home.
Because we've seen and continue to see the extent to which democracies are under threat through various means of foreign interference.
Canada actually has seen a lot of organized crime. Diplomats are threatened, our consulates have been attacked, and often comments are made about, there's interference in our politics.
Nor must we countenance that political convenience determines responses to terrorism, extremism, and violence. Similarly, respect for territorial integrity and non-interference in internal affairs cannot be exercises in cherry-picking.
more about External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jayashankar's response that we have been, in fact, basing this debate on. During an event at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York, S. Jayasankar elaborated on India's response over Canadian allegations. We are giving you a point-by-point reference of what all has he said. Now, S. Jayasankar first goes on to say that if Canada has proof, it needs to show us. That is the first argument that he goes on to make, something that India has been making ever since Justin Trudeau made the allegations inside the Canadian Parliament. Lot of organized crime and violence in Canada. Here's where Mr. S. Jayasankar is refraining for holding down any words. He is in fact accusing Canada of harboring a lot of organized crimes, of giving that safe haven to terrorists and other separatists and secessionist tendencies, elements in Canada, and that's something that he's reiterated here. Proof of extremism operating out of Canada further goes on to make the same point. If we go further, he also says that diplomats are threatened, consulates attack, something which we have seen as a fair enough example in the past where things are getting reported out of Canada which really speak about the same thing. Number of terrorist leaders identified, something that India itself has given a list out to the Canadian authorities in 2018 if we talk about the Khalistan extremist elements, but the Canadian government chose not to do anything about it. Large number of extradition requests made, not just from India, but from other countries as well. That safe haven that India talks about that has been given to terrorists in Canada on Canadian soil, nothing has been done about extraditing because their government policy says so. And that is the kind of safe haven that people who actually find that reprieve in Canada go ahead and exploit and resort to. Canada is permissible to organize crime. Now, this is a very, very clear indication the External Affairs Minister has made, where he has, in as many words, said that the Canadian environment gives that permission to these separatists, secessionists, or even these terrorist forces to operate from there, whether it is domestic politics or otherwise. That safe haven is given to these elements, and that's why they are there in Canada. Politics makes Canada government permissible. He goes ahead and further seconds that entire argument by saying that it is domestic politics that is defining what we see happening out of Canada at the moment. Let me, in fact, take this across to my guests who are joining me on Brass Tacks this evening. Mr. Ashok Sajana, former diplomat; Sushant Sareen, senior fellow ORF; Peter Thoning, who's a senior advocate who is, in fact, representing Hindu Forum Canada. Remember, the Hindu Forum Canada has sought a ban on Khalistani terrorist Gurpatwant Singh Pannu, and that's also an important aspect that we will be discussing today. And also with us is Berzeen Wagmer of SOAS South Asia Institute. Mr. Sajanar, very good evening. I'll begin with you. First of all, talking about the response that has now come in from Dr. S. Jayasankar, considering there was so much that was spoken about on why the EAM is not responding. There was a statement that was released by the Ministry of External Affairs at the outset through the spokesperson, Mr. Bagchi, but nothing, no pointed response coming in from Dr. S. Jayasankar. Now that he finally has, do you think it's apt? Do you think it's delayed? Or do you think he's been forced to respond?
No, I don't think it is delayed. I don't think he's been forced to respond. I think Dr. Jayasankar has responded at the time when he needed to respond. Because I think what needed to be said on the 19th, when Mr. Justin Trudeau made these baseless allegations, he calls them credible allegations, but of course he has not furnished any evidence, any proof to substantiate these allegations, and they were responded to by our official spokesperson saying that they are absurd and motivated. I think that was quite adequate to define these particular allegations. So he did, in his own statement to the UNGA, he did say that political convenience should not determine the response of countries to terrorism or to extremism violence. I think this was definitely a response to, an appropriate response to Canada. And then he got an opportunity, he got a platform at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he made it out very clear that this is not Government of India's policy. Government of India doesn't do this extraterritorial killings. And number two, that we have till date not received any relevant or significant information on this. So you know what you mentioned, Griha, right at the beginning, that the Americans might be upset that we have not taken any action. But you know, if we have not received any relevant information, there is no basis on which we can be expected to take action. So to respond to your question, I think Mr. Dr. Jaishankar's response was very appropriate, very
But Mr.
measured.
Sajjana, no, I mean, I'd like to
I
actually
think
weigh in here. I did not say that America is kind of upset that there is
Yeah,
no
sure.
response coming in from India. My point is that is America taken aback with the kind of response that India has given? They were not really ready for the offensive. Their External Affairs Minister or the Ministry of External Affairs has been known to in fact have in situations like this. Of course, this is an unprecedented situation, but do you think America was not really ready for it? And that's why that public outing has come through a series of statements, whether it is Mr. David Cohen, whether it is Mr. Blinken, or for that matter, Mr. Sullivan. And remember, Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Blinken have been India-friendly figures that we talk about.
Yeah, I would imagine that they still continue to be India-friendly figures. I would still imagine that they are, you know, the India relationship is a very significant relationship. I think even at the level of the president, it has been mentioned that it is, and even Jake Sullivan has mentioned that this is the most significant partnership for the United States. So I don't think that they are, you know, inimical or they have changed their position on as far as that is concerned. So I think we have to look at for reasons as to why these statements have come. But again, to respond to your question directly, I think definitely the Canadians would have been taken by surprise. Maybe they did not expect such a muscular response, such a robust response. But I think Canada and America, as well as the whole world, should recognize that this is a new India. This is not the India of the past. You know, this India will fight for its rights. And, you know, when we find that, you know, even without Griha, and I think you must appreciate this, even without the investigation having been completed, you know, the political leader weighs in and, you know, makes these charges against India. There has not been a charge sheet that has been filed. You know, these are matters, sorry, which are really done by the police. They are, you know, investigation of a crime is not undertaken by the political leaders. They have to wait for the investigative agencies to come up with some results. Obviously, the investigative agencies have not come up with any result. They don't know who killed him. No arrest has been made. No FIR has been issued. And the Prime Minister stands up and says that we have credible allegations. You know, it doesn't square up. And India has to call that out. And India did what it needed to do. If it has surprised some of our friends and partners, so be it. But I think they have to realize that you can't sort of, you know, there cannot be, as the External Affairs Minister said, there cannot be different rules for one for yourself.
Yes.
That, you know, if it is a terrorist, I can go around kill him.
Yeah.
If it is your terrorist, then, you know, he'll be labeled as a freedom fighter. So I think this is hypocrisy, which the External Affairs Minister had no qualms in calling it out.
Mr. Sareen, on this very point that Mr. S. Jaishankar spoke about, when it is about these extraterritorial killings, or for that matter, the sovereign integrity of one's land, it cannot be a cherry-picking environment for the same. Rules cannot be different for two different aspects. When we talk about that, and we take, for example, the killings that have happened in the past on Canadian soil, whether it is about Karima Baloch, whether it is about the Chinese national Weihu, we have immense number of examples of how these people were exiled in Canada. They were finding that sort of safe spot in Canada, and yet they were also allegedly murdered in Canada, possibly by Pakistan and China respectively. At that time, there was no outraging that had come in from the Canadian Prime Minister. Why now that selective approach of Trudeau is being questioned? How do you read that in context of Mr. Jaishankar's statement as well?
Look, in fact, in the case of the other dissidents who have been killed, not only was there no outrage from Mr. Trudeau or anybody else in the Canadian system, there was an active cover-up in whatever happened. And they came out, giving a clean chit without having gone into any kind of investigation, despite the fact
Yes.
that there were serious apprehensions to their life. But on the whole, on what Dr. Jaishankar said, I think he was responding to and in a sense, without naming Canada, he was making India's position very clear on the kind of sneering hypocrisy which we see from some of these Western countries. You were talking about this statement of transnational repression.
Yeah.
Frankly speaking, I don't think that applies to us. Where have we done transnational repression? In fact, the people who have done transnational repression perhaps are the people who have coined this term transnational repression. Number one. Number two, there are other countries which have been notorious for transnational repression, if at all, that it can be called that. So I don't see, all that stuff which has been said either by the Canadian representative during his talk at the UNGA or by the Americans and the various statements that we're making. They don't apply to us. So I don't see why, we need to be defensive or we need to, be responding to those
No, but
statements.
Mr. Sareen, it's one thing to say that it doesn't apply to us. The other thing is that there's a lot of nitpicking on statements that are happening when it is about diplomacy. Now, the statement by External Affairs Minister can also be read in that context, that he is possibly brazening it out. If India has done it, so be it. It can be read as that posturing as well, because Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India is right now known for that kind of muscular politics, and it has been acknowledged also. Whether that acknowledgement internationally is coming or not is the big question, because domestically it is working. But don't you think that it can be read in two different ways if the External Affairs Minister says that why cherry pick on this aspect?
No. Look, he is saying that, look, if you are talking about a rules-based order, then the rules have to apply equally to everybody.
Yes, absolutely.
No, you can't say that I have made the rules, but I can break them whenever I want to break them. Right? Those same rules don't apply to me, because clearly they don't apply to these guys. The Americans go about like a bull in a china shop around the world and do whatever they have to do. Now, if you point that out, people say that, look, why are you saying this? Why should we not say it? So what we are saying is that, look, we made our position very clear. If you have any evidence, bring it out. Now, just yesterday, I believe, this guy, his sidekick, Trudeau's sidekick, that Khalistani terrorist, Jagmeet Singh, he has come out with an interview. Even in that, he say the headlines, again, you see, look at the way the Western media manages the headline. The headline says something, but when you read the story, the guy very clearly says that, no, there was really nothing very specific, nothing which, you could say was a clinching evidence. So they literally have nothing. What they are now doing is they are saying that, look, I am accusing you. You please put a noose around your neck and hang yourself, even though there is no evidence against you. Then we have no proof against you. If you have the proof, please bring it out. You claim to have such great intelligence services and everything, and you have now said that there were 6 people involved. Now, clearly, those were not diplomats like Mr. Sajjanar who were going and in getaway cars and bumping off people. The Indian diplomats don't do that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So obviously there were some people, probably locals. Let us assume they were hired. If they were hired, they were locals. Why haven't you arrested anybody? Why haven't you detained anybody? You haven't questioned anybody. But you have come out openly with your bat swinging and guns firing at India. And you expect us to take his lying down?
Okay.
I'm sorry, it doesn't happen. And if they say that we've exchanged information with us, with India, and India says that, look, yeah, you've spoken about it, but you've not given us any evidence. You've just said that there are these apprehensions or something to that effect. How is that? How does that implicate us?
Right.
But then there is one second, Griya. There's then the issue of the principle of carrying out these kind of attacks. Now, should that principle not apply equally to everyone? I am no defender. By God, I tell you, I swear on my children, I was one of the happiest people when Osama bin Laden was taken out. I think that was the right thing to do. But Osama bin Laden was taken out not in a quote unquote rogue state, as some editors of The Economist call it. Right? Osama bin Laden was taken out in a country which probably even now is titled a major non NATO ally. You never bothered to inform them. You carried out a covert raid. You bumped off people, 6, 7, 8, 10 people. You took a body away, and that was all kosher, right? And you've done it in various other places. So the point is that if that principle applies, then that principle has to apply equally to everybody,
Absolutely.
including to these people.
Absolutely.
So
Mr. Thorning, let me bring you in here. Talking about the law and order situation, and Mr. Sareen, thank you so much for that point. In fact, when you talk about what is happening on Canadian soil, since you are representing the Hindu Forum Canada, they have in fact requested that Pannoon should be implicated for whatever he is doing on Canadian soil, finding that kind of safe haven, for the want of a better word, I'm reusing this one word, this one phrase that has been used by the MEA also, and that's the accusation, the counter accusation that has come in from the Indian side. And for the evidence are far too many that all of these secessionist, terrorist elements, or probably organized crime syndicates, all of them are finding that safe spot in Canada. Pannoon is part of that same sort of a coterie. What is it that you see happening in Canada right now? Because even when we talk about Nijjar's killing, the kind of intel that we've received is that the Canadian police, even the Surrey police, together could not really do anything for a good 20-30 minutes when the killing took place. Mr. Thorning?
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. I'm not aware of the details of the shooting in that case or of the police response in that case. My client is the Hindu Forum, and what we've done is we've sent a letter to the minister asking the minister to conduct an investigation to determine whether or not Mr. Pannoon is a person who is admissible in Canada based on certain statements that he's made or had cause to be made on the internet, including that certain people, all Hindus, should be forced to go home or something like that, as if their home wasn't in Canada. We have asked the minister to conduct an investigation to determine whether or not those comments, which may have been construed as hate speech, ought to render the person inadmissible into Canada. Okay. That's what the request of the government was.
And what has been the response so far?
Well, we haven't heard any response just yet. We expect to get some response in the next few days.
Mr. Wagner, would you like to actually weigh in on this? Considering this is the very recent thing that has happened out of Canada, this is much after Nijjar's killing, Nijjar's death. We have seen how there was a broadcaster which in fact released a statement by Mr. Pannoon asking for Indians, Hindu Canadians, to get out of Canada. And that was how brazen that entire statement was. In fact, somebody from within Trudeau's cabinet really called it out for it to be getting that kind of newsworthiness that it got later. But what does it really say about what is happening under Mr. Trudeau's regime? If all of these rabble-rousers are given that kind of platform, what does it say about organized crime syndicate? These events will continue to happen. Nothing is going to be done in the name of domestic politics.
Ethnic relations, for example, South Asian ethnic relations between Hindus and Sikhs will deteriorate on Mr. Trudeau's watch, who for all purposes and intents is a faddist politician given to woke, fashionable causes. And that has been how he has conducted himself over 3 terms. Mr. Trudeau intends to stand for federal elections for a 4th term. He has made that plain in 2025. The current 3rd term RIA where he serves as Prime Minister has not been one where he came in with a thumping majority. He depends on the National Democratic Party, Mr. Jagmeet Singh's support to prop him up. So he is pandering to a coalition partner. Perforce he has to do that. And we know what Mr. Jagmeet Singh's Khalistani irredentist politics are, like so many others in the Canadian scenario. And more to the point, it has also, from what I envisage, become personal. Like I mentioned, Mr. Trudeau tends to be a faddist politician given to edgy liberal views. He has taken it upon himself to, how shall I put it, get Modi. It's not so much India or Mr. Nijar or the Indian deep state or Indian intelligence. It's a question of get Modi in light of the elections, national elections, which will occur in India in 2024. And Mr. Trudeau fancies himself as an icon of the liberal left, who speaks for many who perceive Modi as a populist in along the lines of a Bolsonaro or a Trump, and that somehow he has to be taken down. And what gets their goat is the adoration Modi receives from his national electorate, which obviously he does, and his fan base, but also those in the diaspora. So it has become personal. And of course, Mr. Trudeau is rather beleaguered given what has happened this week in Canada after the howler in the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa, where a Nazi was felicitated and the speaker had to resign, as was announced this morning.
Yes.
Clearly, he needs to get a handle on matters. And then there's the question of parity, which the Indian Foreign Office brought up, Ria, about last week. Ambassador Sajjanar would know this. From my understanding, there is the high commissions, respective high commissions in Ottawa and New Delhi. But India maintains missions in Toronto and Vancouver, while Canada has in Bombay, Bangalore and Chandigarh. And that's where I would come in. There is no parity in the first instance. Reciprocity involved in running missions and the number of diplomats. But also the Chandigarh mission brings up the whole Punjab question, and which is, I'll put this bluntly, the Punjab problematic.
Okay.
Ria, if TikTok is banned in India, as we are given to understand from reports reading here in London, how is it that Indians are merely downloading TikTok videos of how to get to Canada or to England through all surreptitious means as illegal immigrants? Indians are the third largest group of illegal channel crossings coming into England. And Ria, they all happen to be, they all happen to be from the state of Punjab, which is ostensibly the most prosperous state in the Indian Union. So what exactly is driving them here? The drug addiction problem that you have in Punjab, the rural drug addiction problem to the tune of 77%, the criminal rate, the lumpen elements, they make their way to Canada, as we've seen with all these arrests, which I'm sorry to say are rather belated on the part of the National Investigative Agency in India, and ought to have been done, quite frankly, a bit ahead.
That's also a tit-for-tat reaction. But Mr. Wagner, on the point that you're making, that Trudeau is out there to get Modi, let's actually get Mr. Sajjanar's response on that. Mr. Sajjanar, when it is
remember,
about...
there are 55 billion reasons for Canada to be reticent and for these things to be taken cautiously, because Canadian pension funds have invested in India to the tune of $55 billion, and Indo-Canadian trade stands at $16 billion. That must loom large in the mind of Canadian parliamentarians.
Is that significant enough? Is also something that we will discuss. Mr. Sajjanar, I'd like your response when it is about Trudeau's, the fact that Trudeau's dislike for Narendra Modi's brand of politics, and that's what is making him do that. At least that's what one of the panelists' views are. What happens to the other Western allies? Don't you think India has more strategic importance when compared with Canada vis-a-vis a USA or UK or Australia or other allies?
No, absolutely. You're very right, Griha, because I think if it is so, as your panelist has suggested, that it is, not only the hate of Mr. Modi's politics, but of Mr. Modi himself, as I understood. And if that is the case, then, these are definitely misplaced priorities, because after all, when you are at the head of the government, you're supposed to work for the interests of your people, of your country. And of course, at this moment, in addition to what has been mentioned in terms of the $50 billion plus of investment by the Canadian Pension Fund, in terms of the trade, in terms of the FTA that we are looking at, in terms of the more than 300,000 Indian students who are there in Canada, and they get a lot of foreign exchange, I think into several billions of dollars they bring to Canada. So I think Canada is also a huge beneficiary in terms of its relations with India. And if the Canadian Pension Fund is thinking of investing outside, there can be no better destination than India. But, I think coming to the point that the gentleman made, and, this is something very new that we are hearing, I think Mr. Trudeau has really in the process of committing slow harakiri, because, Mr. Modi is not only popular, passionately popular within his own country, but even outside, I think the importance, the significance, the relevance of India is growing so much for all the right reasons, whether it is, and I don't want to take it only in the context of China, but I think what India represents, India as the largest democracy, that, what Mr. Biden had said, democracies can succeed, the democracies with all the freedoms, elections, etc., and the economies can do well. We have, and even in the last 4-5 years, notwithstanding the COVID pandemic, notwithstanding the war that has been hoisted upon the whole world, India has continued not only to grow but also to continue to do reforms. To make reforms.
Mr. Sareen, would you agree to that point? Because post G20, there was that posturing by India of the Vishwa Guru image. Do you think that was dented because of the allegations that Trudeau...
Vishwamitra now.
Vishwamitra, of course, and due to the allegations that Trudeau made.
Yes.
And in that context, if we talk about the responses that have come in from the Five Eyes Alliance partners also, is it not also putting and questioning Trudeau, because they have not fully supported the entire statement? It's not like a full-throated response in support of Trudeau. But while we say that, and we are going back to the American question, America, while it is not calling out quote-unquote India's diplomatic backsliding, which has been much spoken about and which is what the conversation has become about, at the same time, they do have some sort of, they vary of the diplomatic position that India takes, because External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar also spoke about how it cannot be only about a Western or an American dominance. That needs to change. That narrative needs to change.
It's a lot of things that you have put to me, and I don't think you have enough time, but let me try and answer. See, here is the thing. Number one, I don't buy into all this Vishwamitra, Vishwaguru. I find it nonsensical stuff. We've done what we could, and that has been very... that's been appreciated by many countries without us having to prompt anybody. So I'm one of those who believes that we don't need to blow our own bugle. There are other people who understand what has happened and who appreciate it, and publicly. That is one. Secondly, on this whole democratic backsliding thing, it's such a load of nonsense. Let's talk about American elections. Those are elections which nobody is ready to admit anyways. Maybe 20 years back, everybody would accept an election result and, congratulate the winner and be done with it.
Okay.
Today, they fight like we used to do maybe 20 years back in Bihar or, some other backwater of India. Today, nobody questions an Indian election. And then you say democratic backsliding. In what form? In what way? Please tell us what has happened in specific terms. Okay, yeah, odd incidents have happened, but don't odd incidents happen in Canada or the US? Isn't there a complete breakdown of law and order in major US cities? Isn't there racism in the US police and in a range of other things? I have serious objections to the kind of gender mutilation which is being done of small children. This is what Nazis used to do. Incidentally, Nazis are appreciated and applauded in the Canadian Parliament. Is that not backsliding, democratic backsliding? I could go on and on and on. If I want to be a drain inspector, I can be a better drain inspector than many of these guys, right? The question is, do you want a relationship with India or not? Okay. We are not your pittus. We are not people, that you order and we'll sit down and you order and we'll stand up. We are not a Pakistan. If you think that you are getting another Pakistan as a friend in the form of India, you are not going to get that, right? We have our own agency. We have our own interests, which we want to protect. Just because you tell us to stand up when you want us to stand up and sit down when you want us to sit down, That's not the way things are going to work. If the West cannot
Absolutely.
understand this, it's their problem, not really ours.
All right.
On the other thing, Griha, on the whole, this pension fund and all, I think we are going far too ahead of the curve on this one. I don't think things are that bad also, but the feeling of dislike, I think, as far as India and Canada on Trudeau is concerned, is mutual.
Okay.
If Trudeau doesn't like Mr. Modi, I think Mr. Modi also has utter contempt for somebody like.
Absolutely. But I think we would all agree to this one aspect, that when it is about diplomatic ties, there needs to be some sort of hypocrisy that he also needs to be at play. It can't be as brazen as that. Like, for that matter, America. I'd like to thank all the panelists, because what America is doing with India at the back of the handshake is also what we see coming out of Washington, D.C., where that post of RNAW is still vacant. America is not very happy about the Indian suggestions, and that's also something that needs to be taken into account.